Hi, I'm Dr. Rashawn Ray, aiming to speak truth to power. This is my daily thought. I got to ask an interesting question by one of my friends about why it seems that some blacks seem to be aggrieved or upset when some black people are shown on TV as representing the entire race on a particular issue. In particular, primarily thinking about on Fox News and how Fox News shows some of these people as talking about crime or politics or education or culture, right? Something related to black people. I think there are several issues here. First is that blacks are heterogeneous. So one person kind of speaking for the entire group is problematic. That's something that education scholars have talked a lot about as it relates to blacks when they're in the classroom, particularly in a predominantly white setting, and someone says something about blacks or someone says something about race, and everyone kind of looks to the black person or the Latino person in the room to potentially address this issue as if their experiences allow them to necessarily understand all the nuances of race, which isn't the case at all. I think that's a false assumption that we have, that for some sort of reason, if you're black, then you really understand race and racism. And that's not true at all. You can experience it. It doesn't mean necessarily understand it. Those are two very, very different things. But I think what becomes more useful is to provide some attitudinal data. So Pew recently did a study on views of race and inequality. Blacks and whites are worlds apart. I want to highlight some of these findings that they had with a large sample, a representative sample of blacks and whites living in the United States, on what they think about race and the experiences of race and racism in the United States. So first, if we look at whether or not too much attention is paid to race, what we actually see is that 41% of whites think that too much attention is paid to race, right? On the other hand, only 22% of blacks and 25% of Hispanics believe that we are paying too much attention to race. Part of this might be because 45% of whites compared to 61% of blacks say that race relations are generally bad. So you have 61% of blacks, 58% of Hispanics saying that race relations are generally bad. The other way to think about this is views on our country's progress toward racial inequality. What we actually see is that among whites, 38% of whites believe that enough change has been made as it relates to race, right? I think that's pretty interesting. I think most people might actually assume that the percentage is much higher compared to 53% of whites who say that more change is needed. The disparities are much different for blacks and Latinos. In fact, 88% of blacks and 70% of whites think more change is still needed. Only 8% of blacks think enough change has been made. So when we hear some of these commentators, whether they be Sheriff Clark or Dr. Ben Carson, talking as if inequality doesn't exist, this doesn't match the overwhelming majority of blacks who say something very different. And this divide is primarily related to political orientation. For example, 54% of Republicans, compared to only 17% of Democrats, think that enough change has been made compared to race, right? Relatively speaking, 78% of Democrats think more change is needed compared to only 36% of Republicans. And for independents, they're pretty much even. 43% thinks that enough change has been made. 50% says that more change is still needed. So that really speaks to the political divide in our country and basically what we're seeing now in the United States. Next, who has experienced racial discrimination? This becomes the key thing. So we have attitudes, which is the way we think about that is prejudice, right? Stereotypes, and then we have behavior, which is about discrimination. We can also have discrimination as it relates to policies. That's institutional discrimination that plays out. So when we look at this, 71% of blacks say that they have either occasionally or regularly experienced discrimination, relative to only 30% of whites and 52% of Hispanics. So we see a huge disparity there in who actually experiences discrimination. Now, the question is where do they deal with this discrimination? This question says blacks are, with the percentage of blacks saying that they are treated less fairly than whites in their community. 74% of blacks report that they are treated less fairly by the police in their community, compared to 35% of whites who think that blacks are treated less fairly in their neighborhood. So in other words, this is all about asking about blacks. What blacks think about themselves, what whites think about blacks, right? In the courts, we see a similar disparity. When applying for mortgage loans, we see a similar disparity. 60% of blacks report that they experience discrimination there. When applying for a loan, only 15% of whites think blacks experience discrimination there. Obviously, that has a lot to do with what happened related to subprime mortgage loans and the disparity there. This is the reason why the Department of Justice found egregious forms of discrimination and lending practices among our top banks. In the workplace, we see something similar. In stores, we see something similar, and in voting in elections, even though the gap gets smaller, we still see a huge racial gap there. This next graph is showing specifically blacks who say they're treated less fairly than whites as it relates to these various places, right? So this is a similar graph, but it's basically saying who has actually experienced this, right? So we see a similar pattern, slightly different question. It's just a check to actually make sure that people are thinking about the question in nuanced ways, and we still see a similar pattern. When it comes to who's perceived as being suspicious, who has actually experienced discrimination directly, people acting suspicious around you, 47%, so about half of blacks say that people have acted suspicious around them, more or less. That's interpreted as people who think you are actually suspicious, right? That you might be up to something. This could be being followed around a store or something like this. Another one is saying people acted as if they thought that you weren't smart. 45% of blacks have experienced that, where people have thought that they were not smart. Of course, these are some of the classic stereotypes. And then as it relates to unfair hiring practices, 21% of blacks say that, compared to only 40% of whites. And then unfairly stopped by the police, about 20% of blacks say they've been unfairly stopped by the police. Less than 3% of whites say so. So we see huge disparities in the main ways that we interact with people in society, in public places, in schools, with the police, people in our neighborhoods. We're seeing huge disparities between blacks and whites, as well as between Hispanics and whites in the treatment that individuals have. This next one is talking about who actually whether or not race hinders your success. What we see here are huge disparities. While only 5% of whites say that their race has been more difficult, has made things more difficult, 40% of blacks say that race has made their life more difficult. When it comes to things being made easier, 31%, so about a third of whites, say that race, them being white, has actually made their lives easier. And this comes to its head as it relates to how people see and think about racism. Overwhelmingly, people think about racism as being a sickness, something that is in individuals, a prejudice, right? 70% of whites primarily think that when it comes to discrimination, that prejudice is a bigger problem. It's something in individuals, right? Whereas only 19% think about racism as being built into our laws and institutions. That becomes very important because, see, institutional racism operates whether or not racists exist or not, because the doctrines that we have on the books, the policies we have on the books, were oftentimes created with racist doctrine, with racist thoughts in mind. So these doctrines continue to maintain inequality between groups, even if people aren't inherently racist, right? Among blacks, it's a bit more balanced, but still, I think less so than some people might think. 48% think that it's primarily based on prejudice of individuals, while 40% of blacks say that it is institutional. And then this really brings it to its head as it relates to the progress we made. That over the past 2 years, what we've seen is that our country has made the changes needed to give blacks equal rights with whites. That only 30% of Americans say that's the case. Comparatively, 61% report that our country needs to continue making changes to give blacks equal rights with whites. So we see that this is a huge problem. And then as it relates to optimism about the future, while 40% of whites think that our country will eventually make the changes needed to create racial equality. 43% of blacks think that our country will not. These are the main reasons we are seeing that actually make a divide as it relates to racial attitudes, relates to experiences, and relates to the conversations we have, as well as the political divide. And this is what is happening in our country right now. First, I don't think people really realize the facts and realize how different the worlds are and experiences are between blacks and whites, who can work together every single day, who can be friends. But once they leave that particular interaction in that setting, they have very different experiences. And I don't really think people understand that premise, because you work together. You assume you make the same amount of money. You assume that you live the same type of lifestyle, and that's not really it. So being middle class isn't just about what you have, your education, your occupation, your income, right? Whether or not you own a house, whether or not you're self-employed. It's also about how you experience social class in everyday life. And that becomes, unfortunately, what race trumps. And that is what this particular situation is about as it relates to racial attitudes, and whether or not the commentators we see on mainstream news are actually representing the general population. And as it relates to Fox News, unfortunately, the people who they primarily have on as guests actually are not representative of the broader black population. So thank you for tuning in. Again, conversations matter like Black Lives and Books. I hope that this has spurred an interesting conversation for you and your family members and your friends. Again, you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Sociologist Ray. You can also sign up for a weekly email on RashawnRay.com. Thank you.